the show begin. Next generation for the win. We're going all in. All together now, let's begin. Let the show begin.
I think actually most of you probably don't know me, but I've been doing this sort of presentation for about 30 years now, and what I normally did was essentially to extrapolate on a whole lot of events that had occurred before, that list on the left. But the reason for the rather dramatic title, just going back to it, was that I think something's going to happen now which really will overwhelm most of those sort of extrapolation predictions. The great thing about, of course, over that 30 years, the great thing about it was that, generally speaking, if you get it right, people remember, and if you don't get it right, well, that just fades into the mist of time. This next one is a fairly big one I'm going to make, though. So what we do, so with airline market growth, for example, just look at some of the recent, whether it's regional or global, recent growth in the market, some of the factors that will affect it, in particular airline orders, for example, but also look at what the big manufacturers are saying. Boeing is saying there will be 4.7% annual growth until 2040. That's big because it's twice GDP. It's a very substantial growth in airlines. They're talking about another 40,000 aircraft being produced over that time. A lot of them for replacement, but a lot of them not. And in this region in particular, we're talking about 7% annual growth. But as I said, a lot of it is also about what orders are out there. We've heard about Air India the Indian carriers making massive orders. We have a significant supply chain problem at the moment, and that is really going to slow things down. Also, in terms of looking particularly to the near future, one of the things we've found over time is that there's an inverse correlation between the price of oil and traffic, passenger growth. Fairly obviously, because particularly for low-cost carriers, fuel can take up to about 50% of their total operating costs. So it's very important. If it goes up 10%, there goes their margin. And if they can put fares up, but people won't buy them. So there's that issue in that whole process. Actually, I'll tell you a little story which sort of goes to the overall point that I want to make today. 20 years ago, I did my first conference here in Singapore, and it was called the LCC conference. At that time, there were no LCCs here. There was one guy over in Malaysia who'd bought a couple of aircraft, an Indian guy called Tony Fernandez, and he was the only real believer. All of the major airlines in Asia, the full service carriers, said there would never be LCCs in this region because our fares are significantly lower than most other places, and also our costs are lower. So at this conference, some of you might have heard of C.K. Chong, Doc Chong as he was called. He was one of the great men of aviation in Asia, the CEO of Singapore Airlines at the time. He didn't want to speak at my conference, but about halfway through, I was talking about low-cost growth and what was going to happen to the market, and I saw him waving his hand at me, and I said, "Well, yes, CK, what would you?" He said, "Can I just have the microphone, please?" And he took the microphone, turned and faced the audience, and he spent about 5 minutes explaining to them why there would never be LCCs in Asia. That's only 20 years ago. Most of you wouldn't even imagine life without them. Today, they're about 60% of the seats in this region. We have probably something like 40 LCCs in Asia, South Asia, and Middle East. And very interestingly, we're the only region in the world where we have long-haul low-cost carriers. I think we're going to hear from one in the near future, or one who was in that area. There are 10, give or take, there are 10 wide-body long-haul low-cost carriers in this market. 7 of them operate into Sydney. And that is a real difference. Being a wide-body aircraft, they fly long distances, And again, the model wasn't going to work if you flew long distances. I just make that point because these were not at all visible. They weren't expected and they weren't going to happen. So I think you have to really put aside a lot of your thinking when we get to what's going to happen in the future. Time flies very quickly, and I've only got 15 minutes, so I'll skip through a lot of these others. Traveller profiles we've talked about. Over-tourism is a problem. Tourism growth very closely associated, obviously, with the airlines' growth. Geopolitics, probably the most dangerous period since the Second World War, which is having effects all over the world, particularly with long haul, which really does influence our future growth, which will be much more short haul, be much more in this region. Long haul is struggling somewhat. And the next pandemic, which we're sleepwalking into. If anybody believes there isn't going to be another pandemic, if anybody believes we're actually prepared for it, then they've got a nasty shock coming, I think. It's vital for anybody involved in the tourism business and travel business to have some sort of contingency plan because we know what can happen. Okay. So I've called this the intellectual revolution. I just wanted to put it in the same sort of context as the industrial revolution. That was a couple of hundred years ago. I remember it well. It focused around two things: machines and a new form of power, steam power. And we're seeing a lot of that now in one form or another if you sort of visualize it that way. It totally changed society. It was a massive upheaval. People moved to the city, urbanisation was everything, and it changed the entire social and political structure over about 100 years. The things I'm talking about now, particularly led by AI, which we all know about, and no one's really mentioned the fact that, or hopefully, that quantum computing is probably going to take place, to be invented, as it were, in the next 5 years or so. And that will be AI on steroids. Just accelerates the process so much more. So the first threat of those three I put up there is one that is an existential one, and it's potentially insoluble for the airlines. I mean, we all believe, I think, most of us here, that the world is endangered by global warming, by climate change. We're all doing our little bits around the edges. But seriously, is anybody really that concerned in the day-to-day of whenever I'm going to lose my job, running an airline, running a tourism business? It is important, but it's not for now. And the real question is, when do we hit the wall? For the airlines, it's a critical issue because they have so few options. And it's not 2050 that we're talking about to be net zero. It's this next 10 years that's really critical for everybody. Now, the airlines aren't the ones who are frying the environment. They account for maybe 3%, 4% if you look at all their total emissions. But they are very visible and they're growing fast. And everyone is thinking in terms of business as usual. I talked about Boeing and its forecasts of 4.7% growth a year. Business as usual. What's happening? Can we actually diminish our carbon output? Not at all. And that's really the issue that I think has to be, at some stage, confronted and will have an impact. The three main issues that airlines are looking at in terms of reducing their footprint are offsets. I won't ask how many of you offset your travel when you came here, nor will I ask you how much faith you have in the value of offsets. There have been some pretty awful examples. There is you've probably heard of insets as well, and insets are an attempt to have basically a registered supply chain that shows where the offsets are laid, which gives a bit more integrity to it, but not much. Then we've got SAFs. Last year, 0.5% of fuel used was sustainable aviation fuel. It was about 100 million gallons. To put it in context, by 2050, it'll require 100 billion gallons. And I think that's pretty much impossible. But it's not going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years. We'll be lucky to get to 3 or 4% of the total. And even by 2050, IATA is talking in terms of 20% of its total reduction being due to offsets, even 25 years out. And then I mentioned the supply chain problems. Deliveries of aircraft are much slower, and therefore improving your efficiency by introducing new aircraft is going to be well nigh impossible. So that study that half of Australia's airports, most of Australia's airports and half of its destinations will be in serious trouble in the next 25 years is, I think, one of the early ones done, but it is quite confronting. That's a bit cynical, but really is there enough pressure on airlines to make the difference? Offsets, unfortunately, do not change management behaviour. They really, but perhaps do something. I'll skip through, I'm getting short on time. So AI basically is going to be positive for aviation, particularly in terms of aircraft design, new light materials, new strong materials, and battery tech advances. And then the third one I was talking about, this is perhaps a little bit further down the track, and it's much more localised, is the two phases, urban air mobility, which is basically air taxis within cities, and then the longer form of it, that's the shorter haul. That aircraft's got 18 engines, which are basically the wings, but all electric driven. Carries 6 passengers and will go 200 kilometres. That'll be in commercial flights within probably 18 months. And then you have the larger aircraft, and these are the ones which really are going to change the airline business at the smaller end. And for countries like Australia, will transform regional flying too, which is going to mean a massive breakthrough in connectivity for regional centres, which are too small to support larger, expensive aircraft. So my point there is, individually, each one of these is very important. But what we've got now is this sort of conspiracy of this conspiracy of disruption that we don't know about. As Bob Dylan once said, you know something is happening here, but you don't know what it is. That's our problem. This is the unknown, and these are the big issues that some way are going to evolve over the next year or two. And as a result, my traditional way of looking at things was going back through an extrapolation process, looking at all the past, looking at the indicators of what's going to happen in the future, is largely irrelevant if we're going to walk into a massive storm of unknowns. And of those, the environment, I think, is going to be the toughest one. It hasn't really hit us yet. And I must say, I've been a bit surprised. I suppose it's obvious because it's always there, but that we haven't heard much more about it at this event. People seem a little bit oblivious to the fact that it is this express train coming down the road, down the tracks in the opposite direction. And of course, what happens to aviation is going to happen to tourism. The two are joined at the hip. So on that cheery note, but on a positive point, I think it is, in other words, critical to have good risk management potential processes in place, because it is going to be a risky period. Geopolitically, I think we're seeing that, and that's a good indicator of where we're at. So with that, thank you very much.
They're ready now. Let the show begin. Next generation for the win.